Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Wednesday, January 16th.
Until I get the final plan, I'm reserving the right to cancel the meeting on the 24th.
A $6 billion mixed-use development on the north side is scheduled for a city vote next week, even though final plans have yet to be drawn up. 3 police officers accused of covering up the truth from the Laquan McDonald shooting find out their fates tomorrow. We preview the verdict. Retired Army Colonel Jennifer Pritzker details her scathing rebuke of the Republican Party's positions on transgender individuals.
He was the best governor we've had in our lifetime. He did what needed to be done, not what get him reelected.
Looking back 50 years to Governor Richard Ogilvie's inauguration and the politically risky decision he made shortly thereafter. Behind the scenes at the inauguration and more political news in our weekly edition of Spotlight Politics. And the blues old and new, looking back at 50 years of the blues with the founder of Alligator Records. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. Chicago officials search singer R. Kelly's near West Side warehouse. Eddie Aruza has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Eddie.
Phil, a court order allowed inspectors from the Department of Buildings as well as the fire department to gain access to the warehouse that the R&B singer rents on North Justine Avenue. Officials spent about an hour inside the building today, and late this afternoon, the buildings department said in a statement that investigators found building code violations, including evidence of residential use, as well as work performed without approved plans or permits. But the statement offered no details except to say the violations would be included in the complaint for the singer's next court hearing on Tuesday. Today's inspection comes in the wake of Lifetime Network's explosive series, Surviving R. Kelly, which delves into the many allegations of sexual abuse against the R&B singer. Kelly was acquitted of child pornography charges in 2008 and has long denied any wrongdoing. For the second consecutive day, a group of Chicago mayoral candidates made their case to the Chicago Tribune editorial board. Susanna Mendoza, John Kozlar, Robert Fioretti, Dorothy Brown, and Paul Vallis were asked about their plans to address a number of the city's pressing issues, from improving Chicago public schools to tackling the city's massive pension crisis. Here's a bit of what 3 of the candidates said afterward.
We don't need 50 aldermen. We need a smaller city council, we need term limits, we need full-time jobs, and we have to get rid of the aldermanic privilege.
I'm very clear that I am not Ed Burke's endorsed candidate. That's Gary Chico. I'm not the candidate that Ed Burke hosted a fundraiser for that is now the subject of an illegal extortion scheme. That's Tony Preckwinkle, who is the beneficiary.
The complete demoralization of the police department. You know, McCarthy's been a police superintendent now twice, and those cities just happen to have consent decrees. You know, for a guy who says he learned a lot from New York, he certainly didn't learn the importance of having tasers the night Laquan McDonald was shot.
In related news, the Chicago Board of Elections says it expects to begin early voting at its Loop location on Monday, January 28th, and that will expand to 1 location in each ward on Monday, February 11th. The municipal election is on Tuesday, February 26th. And one of Chicago's and the world's top restaurants is making a counteroffer to the champion Clemson football team. In a tweet this morning, one of the co-founders of Alinea offered the Tigers what he called an actual celebration dinner. Nick Kokonas prefaced the invitation by saying he could care less about college football, probably meaning he could not care less. But Kokonas did say he was not joking about having the team come to Chicago to experience Chef Grant Achat's award-winning cuisine. Alinea's offer comes after President Trump served the team fast food on their visit to the White House earlier this week. Several other celebrities have also extended invitations to the Clemson Tigers. As for the weather, a slight chance of snow overnight, otherwise mostly cloudy, with a low around 25. Then a 50% chance of snow tomorrow with a high near 32. And don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also watch via podcast and the PBS video app. And now, Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Eddie. It is a $6 billion city within a city that could be approved as soon as a week from tomorrow. The developers behind Lincoln Yards are hoping for a quick green light to get started on the project, which would likely be built with the assistance of $800 million in public subsidies. But some aldermen and community groups are asking, what's the rush? As final plans have yet to be unveiled. Paris Schutz has the latest on this ongoing saga. Paris.
Phil, the developer Sterling Bay is slated to release those final master plans sometime this week, possibly as early as tomorrow. And that's it. After all the revisions, this will be their final go for this project. And the developer says it's listened to community concerns. Gone are proposals for that 20,000-seat soccer stadium and a Live Nation entertainment district as you look at some of the renderings for this project. On the table now is more park space as seen by this rendering that they unveiled last week. And the area's alderman, Brian Hopkins, says as long as the specifics check out, he's ready to greenlight a vote before the city's plan commission next week.
Sterling Bay assures me that they've heard my requests, they've heard the community requests that have been made over a period of many months, and if they can codify all of these changes that the community has requested and put it into a master plan document that meets our satisfaction, there's no reason to wait. If they can meet those conditions, we'll have something that the community can support and we can move forward with it.
So what is the opposition to this plan?
Well, I should mention again, there's a Chicago Plan Commission meeting next Thursday, and that's where all these big proposals go to get approved. But the opposition is by community groups and a nearby alderman. They feel that the developer's trying to jam all of this through before a new mayor and city council takes over. They feel like they have a much better shot with Mayor Emanuel, who does want this project and wants the $800 million TIF district to help finance roads and other infrastructure in this development. So these opponents say they want a city-owned public park to go right along this prime riverfront space.
Yes, we want to know if we're going to get 24 acres of public park space and if it's public or private. We don't know that yet, and they have yet to tell us that.
And why is it a distinction whether it's public or private?
Well, will the community have access to it? If it's private, they could close it off any time, and then the public will not be able to have any access to it.
So there is no public parkland proposed for this project, just private parkland, which the Chicago Park District says, well, that's fine, they own it and we can come in and program it. But community groups want a parcel of land owned by General Iron right next door to be purchased by the city. They want to turn that into about 24 acres of parkland. The city has resisted doing that at this point. And skeptics say there's just not enough time between now and that meeting Thursday for the community to get all the answers to their questions.
For something that involves that much taxpayer money and 52 acres worth of development, it would be very unusual for this to proceed to the Plan Commission next week.
So what are the next steps?
Well, seeing the specifics either tomorrow or Friday, the specific details of this plan, how much square footage in the buildings, how tall are the buildings, how much park space really is there. And some of these community groups, they want better streetscapes than have been proposed. They want more park space. They want architecturally well-designed buildings. If the city's plan commission approves all this on Thursday, it would then go before the city council's zoning committee. And here's where the issue of aldermanic prerogative comes in. So this is the rule where aldermen defer zoning decisions to the one alderman whose ward this development is in. In this case, the development is in Brian Hopkins' ward. So if he says go, the alderman will vote with him. This is something that's come up in the mayoral race now. Most of the mayoral candidates are saying, let's get rid of this whole idea of aldermanic prerogative. It gives an alderman way too much power over development. Think of the corruption that could come with that. But Alderman Brian Hopkins says he disagrees.
Who do you want to make this decision? If you don't want your elected representative who's accountable to you and who listens to you, if you don't want them to make the decision, who should make the decision? This is a zoning change, and whether or not it passes has to be up to someone. We can't automate it. We can't have a computer make it. A human being needs to make it, and if it isn't the elected official, it would probably be some bureaucrat who you would never see. You wouldn't know their name. You wouldn't know what their phone number is. You wouldn't know where their office was, and they wouldn't be accountable to you.
So Hopkins says once this final master plan is out, he is going to rush to put together a community meeting in the next week. So he'll be really under the gun to organize it before it goes before the Plan Commission on Thursday. And then he says if he doesn't like what he sees in this plan, or if there's so much opposition in the community, then he will pull this project off of the agenda for next Thursday.
And he has the power to do that.
He does have the power to do that.
Paris, thank you. And now to Carol Marine, and a high-profile advocate for transgender rights. Carol.
When a media-shy Republican billionaire writes an open letter rebuking the GOP's policies, people take notice, and that's exactly what retired Colonel Jennifer Pritzker just did. She wrote a scathing piece in the Washington Post opinion section, and here's part of what she said. To me, restrictions on transgender military service are personal. I am a transgender woman. I am also a Republican who generously supports my party. I've grown frustrated as I watch this Republican administration push to ban transgender military service. I have hoped the Republican Party would reform from within and end its assault on the LGBTQ community, yet the party continues to champion policies that marginalize me out of existence. When the GOP asks me to deliver 6- or 7-figure contributions for the 2020 elections, my first response will be, why should I contribute to my own destruction? Joining us now is businesswoman, philanthropist, and retired Colonel Jennifer Pritzker, who enlisted as a private in the U.S. Army in 1974. She served in both the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. She was on active duty for 8.5 years and then served in the U.S. Army Reserve and the Illinois Army National Guard for another 18.5 years. In her retirement, she founded the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in 2003. She also buys and restores historic homes and turns them into bed and breakfasts on the North Shore. She is the first cousin of Governor J.B. Pritzker, a Democrat. Welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Well, thank you.
You are a deeply private person by all descriptions, and then yet you wrote a very public op-ed. I don't think I've ever seen you do a television interview, and yet you're here now. Why now?
Well, I wrote the op-ed because I felt there was a need for it. I mean, starting with my own personal survival, but also there are 13,000 members of the Armed Forces of the United States who are transgender, and by extrapolation, there are an estimated at least 1.4 million transgender people in the United States. And something needs to be done to help all of them, because no one person can hope for progress in their own life without offering support to people in a similar situation. You don't leave people behind on the battlefield. So I'd like to think that this may have some positive influence on a trend that Mr. Trump has had going back, I guess, to the summer of 2017, when he began his series of tweets attempting to pull back on the changes in policy started in the Obama administration. Don't know if they will make a difference, but if I don't make the effort, then all is lost, not even for just transgender people, but for rights of people in general. Our military needs to be able to choose from as large a talent pool as possible. We don't have to accept everybody, but we do have to have a system in which no group is categorically rejected. You know, have high standards of selection for anything you want, but make it on a merit basis. If you need somebody to be able to do, 100 push-ups to get through jump school, fine. But don't restrict somebody simply because they're some category. Use a defined, quantifiable means of criteria to determine who serves and who doesn't.
Democrats, you write, accept the pronoun I prefer, but they don't exhibit the policy of government you believe in. It's Republicans who better mirror your political views, except not these views. In writing this, did the GOP call you and say, we hear you?
Well, I think on an individual basis, I have had some support from the GOP, because the GOP consists of millions of people, and they don't all think the same thing at the same time. And not every Republican agrees with Mr. Trump. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who have been personally very supportive of me and people like me. And there's, it is a big tent. And take issues and candidacies, elections, one by one. And because we have a two-party system, you have to deal with everybody. So I find myself in the real estate business dealing with a lot of Democratic aldermen.
I'll bet.
in the city of Chicago. And it can be done successfully if we find the common ground. And for example, putting in buildings in Rogers Park that I've put in some new construction in Rogers Park. Actually, I'm on my third new construction in Rogers Park. And I find, for the most part, I can get along with the 49th Ward Alderman, Joe Moore, because there are some things that we both want. We want that ward to, to be more prosperous. I want to make money. And if I make money, then the ward benefits, because I bring in good quality buildings, provide jobs. I like to think that I'm providing affordable housing without a lot of the government add-ons.
So Joe Moore is a Democrat. Am I hearing a case to be made for you to cross over from the Republican to the Democratic Party? After all, I think you were just at an inauguration of a Democrat in Springfield.
Well, my presence at the inauguration was to support a family member. JB is my first cousin. Whether I agree with him or disagree with him on his politics, I will always support him as a human being and as a member of the family. And I was there to support him as a family member. And quite frankly, whether I agree with him or not, and there are a lot of things that I disagree with him on, he's going to have a handful trying to help the state get out of its current financial predicament. And where I differ with the Democrats is we can't go on promising everything to everybody forever. And I think there's a tendency for Democratic administrations to overtax, to have an unrealistic level of expectations of what a government can do, and not allow enough in the private sector to resolve a lot of these issues. But I don't know, I'm not sure if we want to get too deep into that right now.
You wore your military insignia and commendations. Do I read this correctly?
Well, okay, what I've got on is I have miniature versions of awards I received in the military, since part of the topic is based on a discussion of military service, and I think I have something to say about it because I put in a total of 27 years. And the one insignia I have is regimental affiliation. I spent 4 years in the 131st Infantry Regiment. I commanded a company, C Company, 1st Battalion, and I was a battalion intelligence officer. And it means a lot to me that the 131st Infantry was a Chicago-based regiment. It's since been deactivated, but 100 years ago, they were one of the top regiments in the American Expeditionary Force in France. I spent the 4th of July commemorating their participation in the Battle of Hamel in which two companies from the regiment, along with 2 companies from the 132nd, with about 10,000 Australians, took the town of Hamel in France, 4 July 1918.
You talk about giving the military 27 years of service. What did the military give you?
Well, it gave me unusual experience. It gave me a lot of training. It allowed me to qualify in a recognizable profession. It allowed me to rise as far as my own personal merit would allow me. I met a lot of great people in the military.
And yet, you couldn't explore your own femininity in the military. You had to retire in order to transition, right?
Yes, that was always very difficult, because when I was in, there was virtually zero opportunity to explore. For example, I couldn't have gone into the orderly room, that's the office of a unit, and apply for a leave to say, well, First Sergeant, Company Commander, I'm going to take my 30 days leave, and I'm going to go experiment, with living as a woman. That would have earned me like an immediate discharge.
They would have thrown you out.
Oh yeah.
And yet, you have founded this military museum and library. Is there a contradiction in that? You couldn't be the person you really were in the military, and yet you really do have reverence for it, don't you?
Well, regardless of my personal desires, the country needs a military. And I was born 5 years after World War II. So if we hadn't won World War II, with the U.S. military, I probably wouldn't have been born. I also happen to be Jewish. But we also live in a democracy. Policies can be changed. They aren't written in stone. If you're willing to do the work, you can change policies. And I also felt that if I served in the military, I'd have greater credibility to make some of these changes, and I'd have some idea of what is really involved.
We all come from families, faith communities, we have friends, we have colleagues. You mentioned being a Jewish person. Were you supported within the Jewish faith as you made these choices, within your family, your friends?
Well, it's been an evolution. When I was a child, the word transgender scarcely existed. As a matter of fact, discussions of sexuality outside the bounds of clinical discussions, outside the bounds of what goes on in a marriage, simply weren't discussed. The whole idea of LGBTQ rights, as a political issue, it simply didn't exist. A lot of this changed in about the mid-'60s, protests against the Vietnam War, baby boomers coming of age, questioning the values, systems, of their parents, of the greatest generation. But it took a while even for that to occur. And, there've been some changes in people who had a lot of trouble with it before that are more accepting of it now. My gosh, in my youth, simply, if a person assigned as male at birth wore women's clothes publicly, they'd get arrested.
Right.
But those days are long gone. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, for wearing male clothing in 1431.
But you write to the Republican Party that they're trying to run you out of existence. Where is this fight with them and with you?
Well, it's very complicated because I think most people, if you show respect for them, they'll respect you in return. But I think there's certain people who want to make a political issue of it. And there's certain factions in the Republican Party that think if they appeal to people's fear,
like transgender bathrooms, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, for example, the arguments used to support, the defeated North Carolina HB2 bill. I don't know much about, former Governor Pat McGrory. I lived in North Carolina, stationed there in the Army, and I have a significant investment in a factory there. I think it cost him way more than he thought it would, because prior to that, I don't think he made much mention of it. But I think he thought that if he passed that bill, it would gain him more support, and it totally backfired on him, which is unfortunate for him and for the party.
So as this battle plays out, because 2020 is coming, and people are going to be asking you to write some checks, you're not necessarily ready to sign them over at this moment, correct?
Well, now I'm going to be looking a lot more closely at each candidate, Republican or Democrat, where they are on certain issues. And I'm trying to give Mr. Trump an opportunity to rethink some of his statements. And, well, all right, the British parachute school, Bryce Norton, has a slogan, "Knowledge dispels fear." And I wish Mr. Trump and some of the other people who are for some of his statements, I wish they would take the time to study the issue of the transgender phenomena more closely.
And maybe they will. Will you consider coming back and giving us an update as this discussion with your party and on this subject continue?
Well, let's just take things one day at a time.
We shall. Jennifer Pritzker, thank you very much for being
you.
with us. Now, Phil, we go back to you.
Thank you, Carol. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, revisiting the governor who straightened out Illinois' finances and paid for it. A new governor, the race for mayor, and other top political stories in Spotlight Politics. And singing the blues for a modern audience, how Chicago's alligator record stays relevant after 50-plus years. But first, 2 Southwest Side beat officers and a Chicago police detective will find out their fates tomorrow. The 3 are accused of submitting false reports in an attempt to conceal what really happened when police shot Laquan McDonald. All 3 men opted for a bench trial, meaning Cook County Judge Dominica Stevenson, rather than a jury, will determine their guilt or innocence. That trial took place in December. WTTW News reporter Matt Masterson has been following the case and the trial, and he joins us now. So, Matt, what is going to happen in court tomorrow?
Well, Phil, we're finally going to get that verdict in the case of Thomas Gaffney, Joseph Walsh, and David March. They were each charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and official misconduct stemming from that 2014 shooting of Laquan McDonald. Testimony in that case did wrap up back in December, after about 5 days. And then there have been a couple delays so far before the verdict has come out. So we've actually been waiting for this announcement for about a month now, or a little over a month now. And if the men are convicted, they face up to 5 years on both the conspiracy and official misconduct charges, and up to 3 years on the obstruction of justice charge.
And what specifically are these 3 men accused of doing?
So, of course, it was Jason Van Dyke who actually shot and killed Laquan McDonald in that officer-involved shooting back in 2014. But these 3 men were all on scene that night in the moments afterwards, and prosecutors say they basically got together and came up with this false narrative to say that McDonald had attacked and battered 3 officers before he was shot. They did this, of course, according to special prosecutors, in an attempt to try and cover up for Van Dyke, to try and shield him from a criminal prosecution in this case by making it appear as though this shooting had been justified. So prosecutors have tried to prove this by going through the officers' own reports, from the scene, their own documentations that included this identical language about this false narrative. That's what the state has alleged. The defense, of course, has denied all of this. They say there was no conspiracy. The men never got together to talk over these things, and that anything in here was just a by-the-book investigation following an officer-involved shooting.
Well, you mentioned that the trial wrapped up early December. Why is it taking so long to come up with a verdict?
So there have been a couple of delays. Instead of jurors just going and deliberating until they get a verdict in a bench trial like this where the judge makes the verdict, it sort of runs on her timeline. So Judge Stevenson, she initially set a finding date of December 19th, which is about 2 weeks after the trial wrapped up, after the testimony wrapped up. But she, a few days before that, announced that there was going to be a delay, and then she delayed it again until tomorrow, this Thursday. But she hasn't given an explanation for those delays. It was likely due to scheduling issues, due to just the amount of paper physical evidence that was submitted in this case, those reports that she had to go through before she wanted to make a verdict. She wanted to take all the time she could to go through that. But it is interesting that the case has been delayed to this point so that the verdict tomorrow is now coming 1 day before Van Dyke, the man who these officers were allegedly covering for, is going to be sentenced for the murder of Laquan McDonald.
And a little more on why this trial is so important.
So Van Dyke's trial made the bigger headlines, but this verdict is also going to probably have an impact on how Chicago police officers do their job. The Van Dyke trial was just about the shooting of Laquan McDonald, whereas this case has more to do with how police officers do their jobs. And prosecutors keep pointing to this code of silence that some officers would supposedly cover for their fellow officers to help cover up something like the shooting of Laquan McDonald. So a trial like this is certainly a unique case in Cook County where this so-called code of silence hasn't really been put on trial before. These are unprecedented charges against officers, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the judge does rule on it tomorrow.
Matt, thank you. Governor J.B. Pritzker campaigned on moving to a graduated income tax in which the wealthy would pay a higher rate. That would require amending the state constitution. But there was a time Illinois did not have any income tax at all. In this inaugural week, Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicki takes us back 50 years when incoming Governor Richard Ogilvie began to turn state government into what it is today.
Springfield's finances were a mess. How much of a mess?
The first thing that Mike Howlett, who was the controller, he called me one day and he said, I'm not sending out any checks to state employees. I said, Mike, why not? He says, because there's no money in the bank. We have no money.
Sounds a lot like state government these past couple of years, especially during the budget stalemate. But John McCarter isn't talking about today. He's describing the mess Illinois was in circa 1969. Before Illinois had any income tax, the last of the major industrial states without one. It was all but inevitable, but who would have the courage to do it?
There was a lot of talk about the income tax during the campaign. And of course, as any politician would, Ogilvie would say, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but I'm not committing to something like that.
It wasn't long after Governor Richard Ogilvie took the oath of office that he began turning things around, creating Illinois' first ever budget bureau with McCarter at its helm.
The budget had always been done by the legislature, and it was a biennial budget every 2 years. And Governor-elect Ogilvie said, if I'm going to be the governor, I'm going to be the chief executive. If I'm going to be the chief executive, I'm going to have my own budget.
At Ogilvie's direction, McCarter, now a WTTW trustee emeritus, crunched the numbers. He says it became obvious Illinois needed an income tax. Then as now, it was controversial, a political gamble, a new governor and a new tax. Ogilvie, a Republican, knew it, but he twisted arms and made it happen.
With the income tax, he simply made the decision that the state was broke. He had a lot of things he thought ought to happen, and his administration had pledged to do things, and there was no money to do it. And so he decided to do the income tax. And once he decided and put the deal together, he never looked back.
Passing an income tax for his first budget took a complex issue off the table for the Constitutional Convention of 1970. Article 4, Section 3 limits Illinois to a flat tax. A tax on or measured by income shall be at a non-graduated rate. Ogilvie transformed state government in other ways, too. He dared hire women, like Wolf, in professional capacities. Illinois' Environmental Protection Agency was born. Ogilvie, formerly Cook County's sheriff and a war veteran, oversaw the revamping of the state's prisons. His newly created Department of Corrections director, Peter Benzinger, lifted a ban on Sunday visits, started a substance abuse program, and English as a second language classes.
We inherited a very archaic prison system, a youth commission, where 8-year-olds were housed with 18-year-olds in reformatories. I saw that. I went to the governor and said, we can't let this happen. This is abuse, and we changed the law.
Benzinger says Ogilvie gave him both the autonomy and the support to make it happen.
On a partisan basis, I've worked for Republicans and Democrats, 3 different presidents, but the best CEO I've worked for was Richard B. Ogilvie.
Voters disagreed, choosing to oust Ogilvie after only 1 term in favor of Democrat Dan Walker.
If Dick Ogilvie had been reelected, we'd be in so much better shape.
Even Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley publicly rued that outcome.
To his everlasting credit, he had enough guts and courage to do what was necessary at the time. And no one in politics that hasn't got that kind of courage shouldn't be holding public office.
As the saying goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Ogilvie's contemporaries say as Governor Pritzker takes on a tattered state government, he'd be well served to revisit what went on 50 years ago.
Best of my ability.
He was interested in doing the right thing, putting the right policy in place, and those policies have been sustained over time.
Ogilvie just had this vision of what he wanted Illinois to be, and the deep responsibility that he felt to the people who had elected him, to both parties.
Put your polls aside. Put your political party aside. Put your state first, and do what you need to do.
Like Ogilvie, who had solid Republican majorities in his day, Pritzker's taking over at a time that his party has full control of the legislature. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Amanda Vinicky.
During his inaugural address, Pritzker called Illinois' current tax system regressive and unsustainable. Quote, others have lied to you about that fact. I won't, he said, and vowed to move to a graduated income tax. Meanwhile, many of those who worked for the Ogilvie administration consider it a seminal point in their careers and in Illinois history. His staff recently held a 50-year anniversary event to reminisce about it. We have a copy of the program on our website. Also, an old campaign poster that Amanda just happened to find this week in the State House press room. How's that for good timing? Governor J.B. Pritzker takes the helm as new numbers shed light on the dash for campaign cash in the mayor's race. Meanwhile, a date has been set for early voting in that contest. Our political reporters, Paris Schutz, Amanda Vinicky, and Carol Marine have those stories and more on this week's Spotlight Politics. Colleagues, good to see you here. Amanda, let's start with you in the inauguration. Reflections on the spectacle of Pritzker's inauguration.
It certainly was just that. It was a spectacle from the ceremony, which felt more like a concert, and then from the actual concert at it was called an inaugural celebration, but really it was a ball. I mean, this was a lavish affair, turned the state fairgrounds and what is normally, frankly, kind of a crumbly old building, still crumbling, mind you, where the press was seated. And toward the end of the night, I noticed there had to be a bucket because water was dropping from there. So this is a building that, by the way, some of the proceeds from the ticket sales will go toward the State Fair Foundation to restoring buildings such as the one that this event was held at.
The building turns into a pumpkin at midnight.
Yeah, exactly.
But there was there was a lot of secrecy about the cost of the events. How come?
So there was a lot of secrecy about it, and that in part is because Pritzker paid for it out of pocket. Again, I did notice it mentioned ticket sales went for $250. That'll go to charity, but the rest of this, we don't know how much it cost. And in a sense, that is, I think many taxpayers would say, good, we don't want a lavish celebration on something like this. Illinois doesn't have money for this sort of fun stuff. At the same time, it does raise, of course, the questions about just how transparent Pritzker will be. I also, before we move on, want to really quickly say that in terms of outside of the spectacle, just the feeling here, a lot of people were really excited, I think, to see the end of the Rauner administration, even Republicans, and that is just because of the partisan stalemate that existed. And so people right now, I mean, it is a honeymoon. There were a lot, obviously mostly Democrats, but even some Republicans kind of feeling that tension had been lifted. I will add, though, that that is exactly how people were really feeling 4 years ago at the end of the Quinn administration. Wow, something is going to be different with Rauner.
Now, some of us were not at this giant gala, but I heard reliably from another of my colleagues there that one of her former interns, who now is works in the political world, came up to her and said, "Look around. This is what you see in the movies."
Yes.
I mean, it was that beautiful.
It was a transformation. It was
Aside from
gorgeous.
the razzle-dazzle and the theatricality of the inauguration, what are some of the things that people are expecting to be part of his Pritzker's initial agenda items?
Tomorrow he's going to sign the gun dealer licensing bill here in Chicago. That's a bill that passed both chambers under the last governor, but the last governor vetoed it. So it would put restrictions on gun shops in Illinois, because 60% of the guns that are found in Chicago streets come within the state of Illinois. So this is sort of an added layer of protection that Democrats have wanted. So that's something he's going to do right off the bat. He also issued a few executive orders. He's decided to pay relatively high salaries to his staff members. This has gotten a little bit of pushback because he is supplementing their state income out of his own pocket. He's paying some of their salaries, and that Republicans are saying, well, who are these workers going to be loyal to, the state or J.B. Pritzker?
But you could ask that question. No, seriously, I've never seen somebody who worked for any governor's office who actually thought they were working mostly for the state of Illinois taxpayers. They were working for the governor, whether it was Blagojevich, Quinn, Rauner, and now Pritzker. But it is a fair question to ask.
And Amanda, how about that? What reaction have you heard to the fact that the governor is dipping into his own resources to pay some of his top staffers additional money that he says is necessary to attract the best talent?
So there has been most certainly a mixed range of reaction. Some say, good, I don't want to be paying it. Others, however, are saying that it's almost insulting because these are public service jobs. And many of these individuals could go on, likely will go on when they're done serving the administration, to get high-paying salaries because they've got quite the resume, of course, after having served in the administration. There are questions about what does it mean for the staff who aren't in that, say, top 20 or so. And in terms of also, Pritzker will soon be negotiating a contract with AFSCME, the state's largest public employee union. That has been stalled since 2015. Is this really setting up Illinois taxpayers to have to pay a hefty pay raise for AFSCME? Again, this is something that Pritzker has said they are due fair compensation. He's already basically said, yeah, I'm going to give them a raise. So union folks are certainly celebrating that. But those who want Illinois to rein in spending, maybe not so much. So there are certainly many questions outside of that, including ethical ones about what it may mean for just in general, having a wealthy governor. What about, say, the next administration if you don't have somebody who can just reach into his own pockets to pay staff more and wants top talent?
Let's segue to the mayor's race. Paris, there are some new numbers that shed light on how much each of the candidates has raised. What do we know?
Bill Daley and Tony Preckwinkle are outpacing the field here. Bill Daley's got about $2.1 million, close to 2.2. Tony Preckwinkle's just a smidge behind her at about 2.18. Bill Daley is going out of town to raise money. He's raising money from business, from financiers. Tony Preckwinkle is getting nearly all of her money from public employee unions. Behind her is Susana Mendoza and Gary Chico. Gary Chico has about 1.3 million, but he just dropped about 1 million on an ad campaign to try and get his name out there because he wasn't doing very well in the polls.
The governor's race that we just passed spent $200 million plus. We're only at a puny 14 million combined for all of these candidates so far. So
are you saying this is going to be a bargain basement campaign?
This seems like kind of a low budget deal, Phil.
Well,
it
a lot of
does.
candidates are struggling to raise money. Lori Lightfoot, in the 100,000s. I mean, it sounds like a lot of money to us, but it's not a lot for a campaign.
If you want
it's hard
to
to get on.
It's
hard to get on
Paris,
campaign.
how about this? How about Chance the Rapper? He just got in big time. Tell us about that.
Well, Chance the Rapper had been criticized by some of his peers, saying, "Well, if you're really advocating for this candidate, why don't you put your money where your mouth is?" And he did that in a big way. He put $400,000 into her campaign. That vaulted her into
being
Amara Enya, a community activist from Austin who had also worked in the Daley administration. So that vaulted her into 5th place in the cash dash, so she has about $483,000 right now.
Kanye West had already paid some of her election violation bills from the Board of Election, so she has 2 very prominent rap music guys on her side, and the millennials who pay attention to that. I see a lot of Enya signs. I see a lot of Willie Wilson signs up and down
everywhere.
Down Ashland, and so you say to yourself, in an election where the threshold to make it to the runoff could be maybe 15% of the vote, who's gonna pull that threshold?
But Enya really hasn't been vetted. There isn't a lot known about her background. She's run for office before, and there are a lot of other opposing campaigns that say, there's a lot about her to be discovered. And so now if she is going to vault into serious contender status, then some of these opposition stories may come up.
Okay, right now there are, what, 15 candidates? When do we expect that number
there
to
are
sort
13 for sure, 2 more on the bubble.
It looks like Neil Salas Griffin might make the ballot because Willie Wilson late this evening decided to drop his challenge to Salas Griffin, but Dorothy Brown still has a challenge.
Dorothy Brown's in trouble.
Well, Paris, Amanda, Carol, if anyone else gets into trouble, we'll hear about it next week. Thank you very much.
Nominate you, Phil.
Mercy. And up next, one Chicagoan was bitten by the blues. In 1971, one man founded a Chicago record company that would reach a worldwide audience, beginning with the release of Hound Dog Taylor and the House Rockers, through new releases like Shamika Copeland's acclaimed America's Child. Alligator Records has brought house-rocking music to the masses. Their journey is told in the memoir Bitten by the Blues, written by Alligator Records founder Bruce Iglauer with Patrick Roberts. And we are joined now by Bruce Iglauer. And Bruce, welcome back to Chicago tonight.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
As I was making my way through your book, I couldn't help but think of the old Saturday Night Live routine where Dan Aykroyd playing Tom Snyder says, what are the blues and how do you know when you got them? And you have a definition of the blues that I'd never read, and it has to do with folk music. I'd never thought of it that way. Amplify on your definition.
Well, the blues is a traditional music. It grew up down south, created by African-American people to make them feel better in a terribly oppressed situation. And then it moved up north and became electrified, but it's still a traditional music that's been handed down from generation to generation.
And you write about the very first time you heard the blues in a way that really impacted you, and this was back in January of 1966. You heard an artist named Mississippi Fred McDowell. Tell me about that first experience.
It was at the University of Chicago Folk Festival, and I had come down kind of not knowing what I was going to hear. I was a folk music fan, and Fred, an older guy from northern Mississippi with a slide on his finger, playing guitar, singing songs of his life, reached out across 20 rows of seats and grabbed me and slapped me grabbed me by the collar and slapped me and said, "Wake up, wake up, this is for you." I thought it was the most honest music I had ever heard.
And you talk about some of the clubs that you went to, many of them, just about most of which don't exist anymore, including a place called Florence's Club, and hearing Hound Dog Taylor and his band there. And you say that's where your dream began. What happened there that created this dream for you?
I went to this little club at 54th and Shields on a Sunday afternoon and stepped in the door, and I heard again the sound of steel on steel, like Fred McDowell, the slide guitar, and a beat that just was so impossible to deny. I can't dance. I could dance to Hound Dog Taylor. I pushed my way through the crowd, and there were 3 guys making the happiest music I had ever heard. It was just so compelling. It just made you grin from ear to ear. I fell in love with the band, and I started a record company to record them.
Because this is not what you started out to be. You were a theater major at Lawrence University?
Right, up in Wisconsin. I was supposed to be an academic. I was supposed to teach the history of the theater, and I got waylaid by the blues.
Waylaid by the blues, and part of what you did, and it's so interesting because you talk about producing a record, and you say producing a record goes way beyond just making sure that the equipment is working and the mics are working. It has to do with managing people. Any instances come to mind where you're in the studio and you've got this fluid situation where you're not exactly sure what's going to happen with the musicians?
I've had sessions where I completely didn't know what was going to happen with the musicians. In the book, I talk about the first time I recorded Little Ed and the Blues Imperials. They came in to do 2 songs for an anthology and ended up in 3 hours recording 30 songs. I went out and shook hands on a contract 10 songs in, and we made the whole record in 3 hours.
In 3 hours?
With no rehearsal. They just played every song they knew.
You also talk about another time when Junior Wells and Buddy Guy came in to record something, and there was no set list, there was no...
Oh, this was when I was still working for another label, for Delmark Records, for the legendary Bob Kester, my big hero in life, and he just let fly. He let Junior do whatever he wanted to do, and Junior made up songs in stream of consciousness, singing about Mayor Daley and singing about relationships between men and women, and the band just fell in and created the music right in front of me.
So it was pretty unstructured back then, but you like
I'm a little more structured.
A little more structured. You want a set list, and
I like to know what we're going to record before we record it. I even have such things as rehearsal.
Oh my goodness! But the stories you tell not just have to do with what happens musically, but the personalities of some of these people. For example, you tell a tale of Junior Wells. And first of all, remind people who Junior Wells is and tell me the story about the $100 bill.
Junior Wells was a great blues singer and harmonica player, originally from Tennessee, but became a star on the South Side. And his home base was Teresa's at 40th in Indiana. Junior and I used to go outside Teresa's with a bottle and a brown paper bag and enjoy the intermissions together. And at one point, a fellow came up to Junior and asked him to borrow $20 in more casual terms, and Junior pointed out that the fellow still owed him $10 from the week before, and the fellow would not go away. So Junior pulled out a crisp new $100 bill, dropped it between his feet, and said, "Pick it up. There it is. Just pick it up." And everybody knew that Junior traveled well armed. And the fellow was looking at the $100 and looking at Junior and looking at the $100, and eventually he just put up his hands and backed down the street because he knew that if he leaned down, he probably would never stand up again.
Over the course of the life of the label, 40 years or so, you've gone from vinyl to CD. Tell us about the transition of technology and what that has meant for your label.
Well, we've tried to be on the cutting edge of technology. We started with LPs. We made some 8-tracks. We made cassettes. We got into the CD business very early, and for a while we dominated the blues market with our CDs. More recently, of course, digital files have become the means that people listen to music, either by accessing it on streaming services or by buying downloads. And our audiences tended to get a little older with the passing years. I'm one of them. And they haven't adapted as easily to the new technologies. So we're fighting to get people to go to Spotify or to Apple Music or to Amazon Music Unlimited to stream songs, because that's the wave of the future.
Speaking of the future, and you allude to this, that you write in the book that you have an aging but loyal following. What is the future of the blues? If you go to a blues festival, for example, tell me who you see in the audience, in the crowd.
You see a lot of people who look way too much like me, who have gray hair, who are a little long in the tooth. It's my job to find and create and turn on the new audience for the blues. And in order to do that, blues artists have to be writing about contemporary subjects. They have to be writing, "Woke up this morning and my hard drive crashed." And they have to make music with danceable beats. Blues has always been dance music, but I'm not hearing blues with hip-hop beats, and we need to do that.
One of the things that you have had some recent successes, like Toronzo Cannon. He's a bluesman and CTA driver. We featured him on the show, and I alluded to Shamika Copeland. What do you look for in a young blues artist?
I look for somebody who's got a great sense of the tradition, but has their own statement to make. So they have one foot in the past and one foot in the future. I look for passion. Of course, I look for musicianship, singing and playing. I look for people who have their heads on straight, but it's a gut thing. When I first saw Shamika Copeland in New York, she was 17, and I knew in one song that she had to be recorded. With Toronto, it took years of going to see him before he was ready, but then he got very ready.
So you had this big revelation in 1966 where you were thrilled, where you felt somebody was, by virtue of how they were performing, was reaching out and saying, pay attention.
Yes.
Do you still get that feeling today with artists?
I can. I'm tough to please, but there are nights when the music just overwhelms me and carries me away, and sometimes I'll make those decisions about, I've got to record that artist because that thing happened to me, that soul-to-soul communication.
Bruce Eglauer, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Again, the book is called Bitten by the Blues, The Alligator Record Story. You can read an excerpt on our website. And back in a moment, so stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and join us tomorrow night live at 7. 3 Chicago police officers accused of a cover-up in the police shooting of teenager Laquan McDonald learned their fates. And you know him as Mr. Bates from Downton Abbey. Actor Brendan Coyle talks about bringing a new play to Chicago. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.